It's really good to be back, and it's good to see so many people. This is a bit of a family reunion, but as I can see, Tamar, you've had more kids. We have a lot of folks here, and especially this early in the morning. I apologize for my voice. I have a bit of a cold, and the last few days we've been working really long hours and really fighting for my hometown. The work that introduced me to the subject that you all are focused on was the struggle of my home community. And in many ways, I've never changed jobs because I feel like I'm still doing the same thing. But what I'd like to do is just take a few minutes, give you a sense of my changed perspective on the work that you do and that many of us did together from the perspective of my new role, but really reserve as much time for interaction, for whatever questions you might have or comments or suggestions. You know, I get a lot of suggestions in this job. Places I should visit, for example. But you look good. I mean, have you lost weight? Have you been working out? It's nice to see everyone. So I will say this. I miss the work that you do very much. The work of the Center for Community Progress, and even going back before that, my work, and I think about Frank when we first sort of conceptualized the Genesee County Land Bank, which was what got me started in all this. The thing that I miss most about it, and that you get to experience every day, is the immediate and tangible impact of the work you do. And I know sometimes you're so engaged in it, you maybe, as I often did, lose perspective on that. But coming from the policymaking role that I now have, the thing I miss most is being able to go into a neighborhood in my hometown or in one of the many other communities that Community Progress works with and actually see change, see the view that a child experiences from their front porch transformed from something that's ugly and depressing to something that's beautiful again. And the effect that that has on the way individuals view themselves, the way communities view themselves, and what that does to the trajectory for those places and for those individuals is extraordinary. And when you get into the sort of abstraction of policymaking the way I do now, I really miss that part of it. So I mentioned Flint. And of course, a lot of the work that we're doing right now is focused on rescuing Flint from a crisis that was very much inflicted upon it by bad policy and some callous actions by state government. The reason I mention that is I'd like to sort of frame this subject, the work that we do, the work that you do, around some of the other policy questions that clearly affect our success and your success. Because I think it is important, while we need more tools and certainly need more resources in the struggle to reclaim vacant property, the context of all that work, the backdrop of that work, also needs to be affected. And we can't continue down a path where we and you work so hard to breathe life back into these places. And in the meantime, we have headwinds working against you that are the result of policy decisions that are made on a daily basis that make your job more difficult. So while we need to empower you, and this is what Community Progress is all about, creating better policy, advocating for better policy, and then helping implement those ideas, I think it's incumbent on all of us to also push back against those drivers of blight, those drivers of abandonment that make our work so much more difficult. And sort of where I began my work is Flint, and it's a case study in how those external forces work against the community's really strong will to overcome the struggles that it's facing. In Flint, what you have is an extreme example of what we all deal with. Policy, whether it's state tax policy, municipal finance systems, or even at the national and global level, policies that incentivize the relocation of wealth out of cities into green space, transportation policy, et cetera. All of that working against the work that you do. Flint is an extreme example in the sense that state government made a series of choices about how they finance their own operations and finance city government, which combined with globalization, regionalization of wealth, loss of manufacturing, population loss resulting from all of that, conspired against this great old city. And then that conspiracy essentially was doubled down by a state that essentially balanced its budget by unbalancing the budget of the city of Flint. And resulting from that were a whole series of decisions that not only led to the poisoning of the water, but exacerbated the problem that you deal with every single day. I mean, we have made some progress in Flint. Much of the work resulting from what you do, creating the land bank, getting those blight removal funds, rethinking how the federal government allows money to be used, rethinking how hardest hit, for example, is able to be redirected into blight removal. Big step forward. But to see the state government then take steps that actually undermine all that great work is enormously frustrating. So as we continue to work on better tools and more resources, I think we all have to use our voices, and you're very much legitimized in this space because you're on the ground in these communities. We have to use our voices to fight for policy that values community, values those spaces in a way that prevents even further decline. And this is the big concern that I have about Flint, because what is the long-term effect of the Flint water crisis? Well, it's a lot of things. The most, I guess, depressing, the saddest aspect of it is that because lead is a neurotoxin, children will have their development affected. But also, we will see more population loss. People make decisions every day about where they live based on what the quality of life is. So that decision makes the job that we're doing in Flint more difficult. The reason I focus on Flint is that it is only an extreme example of issues of policy that you deal with every day. I mean, just think about the range of policy decisions that are made at the federal level, at the state level, and even at the regional level that make your job more difficult. The context of your work. Transportation policy. The way the federal government, for example, continues, despite our much better knowledge of this subject, continue to invest in sprawl, continue to invest in unsustainable development. I mean, just think about it. It's never questioned that the federal government, without really any private investment, would invest in a new highway interchange that could be a magnet for development, could be a magnet to move wealth, economic activity, population out of a city into the suburbs, into the green space. But we can't figure out how to just modestly underwrite the cost of operating a grocery store in an urban neighborhood. I mean, what really is infrastructure? The notion that we have policy that almost without question impacts development patterns using enormous federal resources, but we can't figure out how to organize even modest resources to provide for the basic elements of a community, of a neighborhood, really challenges the way policy plays itself out. That's one of the big hurdles that we continually have to overcome in the work that we are doing. And I say we because whenever I talk about community progress, I get like 2 minutes into the conversation and I'm right back to we again. So I do feel like I'm a permanent part of the family. I hope that's true. But the same would be, we have infrastructure. The same is true of housing policy. And we often don't think about this, but whether it's the tax code or the new environment, and we have to be honest about this, the new regulatory environment around mortgage financing has gone some significant direction, some positive steps in terms of providing some sanity and some security and some protections for consumers. But we have to acknowledge that there are some unintended consequences that we have to address. So we have an environment now, and I know the folks in this room deal with this all the time, where in really weak markets, where housing prices are relatively low, it's tough to get a small mortgage. And so how do we breathe life into these properties, into these communities, into these neighborhoods, if we have a housing finance system that makes it really tough to get a small mortgage, to get someone financed? And when I bring this up with, I'm on the Financial Services Committee in the House, when I bring this up with my colleagues, by the way, the committee is sort of left coast, right coast, and then a few of us. When I bring it up, I'm reminded that, yeah, we can do small mortgages, Dan. I mean, where I am, we'll do a $200,000, $250,000 mortgage, no problem. I bought my son a house in Flint because he was moving out. I bought him a nice house in Flint, a 3-bedroom home in one of our better neighborhoods for $22,000. The notion that we lock that marketplace out of traditional housing finance is really a problem. We need to be able to address that. That's policy, and that, in part, an unintended consequence of policy choices that we've made. So we need to address that, and we do have some ideas about how to get there. And I mentioned this is state policy, but the federal government can't be absent in the conversation about how we fund and support cities. Cities are not sort of accidents. Cities happen for a purpose. Cities are where ingenuity occurs. I mean, the history of the world is written in a way that describes the growth and development of society around ideas that are born in places where people live and work in close proximity to one another. So we ought not be ambivalent or agnostic on the question of the form of land use or the form of development that is essential to our economic vitality. Yet, despite the fact that the strength of the American city, I believe, is the greatest variable determining our competitiveness, our economic growth, which leads really to our ability to provide equity in this society. Despite that, to a great extent, the federal role has been to stay out of the game. I believe that if the federal government is going to make investment in the development of society, we ought to enrich that investment with values consistent with our needs and our interest in what we believe. And if we believe cities matter, we ought to require states to begin to look at systems of municipal finance that do not put cities in a position where the property tax system, income tax system, the development patterns work against those places. And there are tools. I mean, those of you who have done some of the work that we've done in the past dealing with the leadership challenge of all this understand the difference between technical and adaptive challenges. The technical solutions are not that difficult to determine. We could, for example, implement policy that simply requires disproportionate use of economic development tools to be driven into the existing built environment. Basically saying that if we're going to incentivize development, we're going to do it in the most sustainable way possible. And I think about my home state of Michigan, where 70% of the people live on 8% of the land. We ought to be investing in that place, but we are not. We are actually allowing the most short-term thinking to drive development patterns, which in the long term, even in the intermediate term, is far more expensive, creates far less equity, and makes your job so much more difficult. Because in many regions, we are seeing development, lots of development, without any real population growth to support that development. We're increasing the cost of government without increasing the number of people or the value of economic activity to support it. It's unsustainable. The federal government ought to condition our support on practices at the state level that support the long-term viability of cities. That, to me, if there's one looming institutional failure that we have got, I know Community Progress has worked on this, that we have got to get more attention around. It's like the financial crisis that the city of Flint or the city of Detroit has faced. It's just the tip of the iceberg. We have a broken system of municipal finance. We have to address it because we continue to pour work and resources into rebuilding these places. We have to rebuild them in a way that value is sustained. We've got some distance to travel before getting there. I could go into more, but I'll touch on I think where we're going in terms of federal policy and where we need to go. Lots of these drivers need to be addressed. The context needs to be changed for the work you do. And then we need to give communities more tools to deal with blight and abandonment. A good example, but a small step forward, was finally getting the federal government to rethink the way the TARP funds through hardest hit were being deployed. The notion that we had to argue, the first bill that I introduced was the bill to allow those dollars to be used for demolition. The fact that we had to argue that in communities that have had significant population loss and have lots of blight and abandonment, that somehow getting rid of that blight, changing the supply-demand equation, increasing the quality of community, the fact that we had to argue that fundamentally that would reduce abandonment and foreclosure just tells you a little bit about how little thought often goes into the needs of these older communities when those policies are being developed. We have a culture that is focused entirely on the conflation of growth with quality. That only communities that are growing are good communities. And the only way to measure quality is growth, when it ought to be the experience that people have every day living in their neighborhoods that determine quality of place. And we ought to be willing to make a long-term investment in those places, even when they're experiencing decline. We don't do that. We need to do that. And that's where I think that small step forward with hardest hit, which in Michigan has meant a few $100 million to deal with blight. Big step for me in Flint, but not nearly enough. That is really where we need to take the conversation. And so, last thing we'll do, and of the many big things that Congress is not doing, a list far too long for me to go through. I would need a PowerPoint for that. The one that I think has the greatest likelihood of getting attention, sort of getting legs, it's not immigration reform, although we ought to. It's not reforming the tax code, we got to get there. It's not a bigger, better budget deal, we certainly have to do that. It's infrastructure. Because across the spectrum, we know that our global competition is investing much more than we are in infrastructure. The issue is this: we could do this right, or we could do this wrong. The day will come soon. Maybe we capitalize a national infrastructure bank with reform of our international taxation system. That's the direction I'm pushing. But the day will come where we'll have to do this. The worry that I have is that if we are not in the game on this, we're going to see infrastructure investment that doubles down on unsustainable development patterns. What we need to do is leverage that moment to get in that initiative a discrete program. And I'm taking over some of you might remember a proposal that the president advanced called Project Rebuild. I'm sort of taken that bill from my colleagues who had been advancing it and rewriting it with the input of a lot of folks in this room and I'd like to ask for more input. Essentially what we're going to propose is if we move forward on infrastructure with $1 trillion or $500 billion investment on the public side, we need to carve out some discrete work that would support what you're doing. And a project rebuild, a rethought project rebuild, is what we need to be prepared to insert into that. What we've suggested is taking about a $30 billion approach, which when you think about NSP, that would be roughly 4 times the size of the neighborhood stabilization program. And develop support through that program on the notion that if we're going to invest in big public infrastructure, we have to reset markets in some of these weak places so that that investment has some value. I mean, it would make a difference to have new infrastructure in places like Flint or Cleveland or Baltimore. But what's above grade works against what we put below grade if we don't get it right. We need to reset these markets. So I think the argument we have to make is that if we're going to go big on that number, on infrastructure, let's invest at least, and of course, only in Washington is $30 billion, a modest investment, but let's invest in resetting these markets so that the full advantage of that new infrastructure investment can be realized. And we can then argue for the much more sustainable approach to development that rethinking and unlocking urban land would provide. And I won't go into the detail on this, but I want to encourage you to engage with us. And Allison Scher, my legislative counsel, is here. I know she's talked to some of you. I'd love for you to connect with her as we put this together. So that would be federal investment in developing and supporting land banks, in demolition, in acquisition rehab, in development, in infrastructure, in actually helping communities retool their infrastructure so that it's more efficient, more cost effective, which leads me to my last point, which is where I began. Flint, literally where I began. It's my birthplace. It's amazing what you can get done when you're willing to threaten to shut down the federal government. So last night, after 4 years in Congress and talking about Flint on a regular basis, Congress, in a bipartisan way, voted to authorize $170 million to help Flint retool its water infrastructure. So if I have my way, that will be a pilot for what we do in communities that are struggling all across the country. We need that sort of investment, or a community like Flint is not going to be able to take advantage of all the great work that's going on. What happened in Flint was not done by the people of Flint. It was done to them. And it wasn't just done by people of ill will, although there are a few. And it wasn't just a whole series of really dumb decisions, although there were many. It was mostly a result of policy that is biased against cities, and especially biased against older cities that have experienced significant loss of population, often driven by those same policies themselves. That's where we need to go. And we need to be willing to continue to experiment. This is what community progress has always been about: finding new tools, trying them in places, and then refining them, like we have with the land bank concept. Every iteration of that concept has been better than the last. It's absolutely the case. I'm looking at Frank, and I remember these conversations, and we essentially took the view that we were going to learn from what the folks who came before us wish they would have done. We need to continue that. We need to continue innovation around, and this is what Project Rebuild perhaps could do, pilot ideas around equity assurance models, for example, in communities where it's really hard to get financing, or it's really hard to encourage an individual or a company to take the risk of investing in that place because of the equity risk that they take in that investment. Let's take away some of that risk. Let's create new models to incentivize private investment. Or another notion we've been tossing around, a reuse bond at the beginning of the construction of built properties. I mean, we all pay. I mean, ask Nigel Griswold to give you the data. Make sure you have time, but we all pay. We all pay for abandonment. We all pay for demolition. We all pay for the lack of those interventions with the loss of value in surrounding land. The data is so crystal clear that it tells the story itself. The thought is maybe we figure out a way to pre-fund reuse of property the same way we insure against other eventualities, so that if we're going to pay, let's do it in a way that makes the most sense and creates the most positive externalities. Those are the sorts of innovations that we want to fuel with piloted federal programs. This is what you do, and this is where the work that I now do matches up with the work I once did, which is the best work I ever did, to be honest with you, the work you do. Why don't I stop now? And I'd love to take questions, comments, suggestions, whatever. Thank you all very, very much.
I have a question right here.
Where are you? Okay,
Right.
yeah.
Good morning. I'm Michelle with United Community Housing Coalition in Detroit. I have to ask this question because you mentioned the hardest hit funds. And I certainly believe in the need for demolition, and I think that government dollars are pretty much the only dollars being spent to do demolition. But in the case of the hardest hit funds being used for that purpose, they were diverted from foreclosure prevention. And we know that we have a strong link between foreclosure and blight. And my feeling is that often it costs more to demolish a building than it would have to fully pay off the back taxes that caused that foreclosure in the first place. So it feels as though we're paying for an amputation instead of removing a tumor. And I just wonder if you can speak to that, please.
Sure. It's a good question, and it gets to the need to balance the tools we have and customize the tools based on the condition. I would agree that we need to ensure that money determined to be used for foreclosure prevention be used for that purpose. The reason it was critical to expand the use of hardest hit is that demolition, to me, is not a distinction from foreclosure prevention. It is also for foreclosure prevention. It's a different technique. But that doesn't forgive communities the obligation to be thoughtful about how that's done. And that's where it becomes more difficult. But again, the data is really important here, because what the data will show us is that there are a lot of positive externalities associated with demolition of properties for which there is no potential other use. And that's the critical question. And that's why the thoughtful involvement of land banks who, if we do it right, have the capacity to be patient and to hold property and secure those properties for a potential use are a critical part of this. But there does come a moment where we've gone so far and the supply question is so far out of sync with the reality on the ground in the marketplace that demolition's the only answer. The problem we've had is we just didn't have resources to do that. So when measuring all of these tools, we have to make sure that we're not just looking at the transactional value of a demolition, or for that matter, the transactional value of any intervention. If we continue to think about it in transactional terms, we're going to miss the bigger question. What are the externalities? And they're not all public. They're not all public. And it's a really good question, by the way, so hear me out on this. And people in this room know this better than I do, but I think it's important for us to remind ourselves that the demolition of a single home has an impact not just on that particular property and the cost to government associated with that property, although we've always advocated that abandoned property generally costs more to local governments than occupied property. but the impact on surrounding property is so clear. But often what we do is we just measure the public value, the public transactional costs of decreased property tax revenues associated with that. But I think we need to go to a different place. We need to think about unlocking private equity, restoring private equity, and what that means in terms of an individual's ability to stay where they are with the idea that their equity will provide later financial security, or that equity might be a much wiser source of investment in a child's education than sort of the ridiculous structure that we have right now for financing higher education. And we could go on and on with that. Your fundamental point is correct, but I think we need to be careful not to sort of pit one particular interest of a program against another. We ought to acknowledge that the problem we have is not that we have competing interests that we have to reconcile. That pits us against one another. What we ought to recognize is that the resources are inadequate to deal with the problems that we're facing on the ground, and there's a big cost to not having more resources. And in Congress, I mean, we're sort of in the resource business. So that's the message that I think folks that are in the job I have need to hear from folks like you.
Congressman, over here to your far left.
Good morning. My name is John Wood with the city of Kansas City, Missouri. One of the problems we've had in the last 8 years, unfortunately, has been a lack of a consistent, persistent urban policy. One of those issues has been, of course, the chronic presence of abandoned and vacant property, low-value real estate, particularly in our urban core. Unfortunately, I think one of the pieces that contribute to that is the Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, FHA, financing these tranches of real estate to investors. These investors own, they tend to flip, they reinvest, and they're just to make their money, but they don't reinvest back into the neighborhoods where these properties are located. Any particular thoughts on an urban policy that will address that problem?
Yes, I mean, a whole slew of them. And one of them goes right to the example that you bring up, and that's the mortgage financing system. Whatever we do, and we need to do something to either rebuild, rethink the mortgage securitization platform, even if we go beyond that and come up with ways to incentivize portfolio lending from lenders, because I mean, we got to have the 30-year fixed in order to. I mean, my view is that our market is calibrated against the 30-year fixed mortgage, so we got to preserve that. But the typical 30-year mortgage is not a 30-year investment for a lender. We need to recognize that if we can incentivize portfolio lending, we could perhaps end up getting at some of those smaller mortgages, which it gets to some of the problem. We have a mortgage finance system that, and combined with our tax code, and this gets into all sorts of problems. People get mad when you start talking about this. But when you take the tax code and the way we incentivize debt in housing and the mortgage financing system that makes it difficult to get small mortgages, you have immediately an anti-urban bias in the housing finance system, just because of what's happened in cities and what's gone on with property values. We have to address that and get into the game in such a way that if, and I think the federal government clearly has to be in that game, we have to have a direct federal role in order to maintain that 30-year fixed mortgage. But we ought not just end it there. We ought to say, look, we're going to have an impact on what these products look like, because home ownership is not just a transaction. This gets back to this fundamental disconnect. And I think the political environment has fueled this, that we tend to look at everything on the balance sheet, everything. And you know, you can't put everything on a balance sheet. What happened in Flint, not to obsess about it, but it is my home, was the result of transactional thinking, balance sheet orientation, not thinking about the use of the financial tools we have to achieve results that don't have much to do with profit margins or transactions. And when we get into housing, that's especially important. And your basic point about urban policy, we haven't had an urban policy in this country for a long time. A long time. And I'm a Democrat. Democrats and Republicans both own that problem. We do. When I got on the Financial Services Committee, right when I got to Congress, I fought to get on that committee because it has jurisdiction over housing and urban policy. And I've been on the committee for 4 years. Most of the time, I feel like I'm sitting on a civil jury with warring interests fighting over wealth that never touches the people that I work for. Battles between investors and lenders and offshore, and I mean, this is ridiculous. So, I can't go political here, but I would just suggest that we have more folks involved in the conversation that don't look at the transactional value of policy as the ultimate measure of its efficacy. That's I think, where we're really off center.
I have a question to your far
I
right.
guess we have one more, I think.
Right, to your far right.
Unless Frank has a question.
To your far right,
Where are
Congressman.
you? To my far. I never look to my far right. I don't listen to anybody on my far right.
Good morning. This is Quincy Murphy. How you doing?
Hey, Quincy.
How you?
How
Good.
are you?
My question, I'm from the city of Flint.
You sure are.
I've been working with the land bank for about 4 years, but one of the issues that I realized that need to be addressed is non-structural blight. You have a lot of vacant land that have a lot of brush hauled that's been there for decades, and trash and a lot of backyards and the vacant houses is not being addressed. And even with the Clean and Green program, that's good, but it's not enough. Have you thought about creating a program to incorporate in the land bank that will address non-structural blight and convert vacant land into beautiful green space?
Great question, and the answer is yes. One of the, and there's multiple levels where that decision needs to be addressed. In this Project Rebuild concept that we're working through, we would empower communities who operate land banks to draw the money down, not just for transactions. I mean, let's face it, I hate to be a broken record, but if everything we do has to be a transaction, we're kind of missing the point. We need operational support for land banks, for management and for maintenance of property that is not conditioned on its ultimate sale. And even in NSP, where we had land banking as an explicit authorized use, we had the clock ticking on every land bank property. It had to end with an outcome, a transaction. That was not right. It was not the right approach. So yes, in terms of the federal role, which is the job I have now, but you know, when Frank and I put together the Genesee County Land Bank model, which was basically a whiteboard, thank God it worked. I mean, would I be here if it hadn't had some possibilities? No. But when we put that together, and Frank did kind of make the point, sorta, one of the things that we assumed is that the economic model that we created would continue. In other words, what we did, without going completely back to lectures that you all have heard me give many, many times, we reformed the tax collection process, cut out the speculators, used the upside derived from tax liens, and plowed that money back into operating the land bank. And we were raising somewhere just under $2 million a year through that process, but it was dependent on something that we ought not have depended it upon, and that is continued adherence to that economic model. And what happened was, the same way the state balanced its budget by unbalancing Flint's, the County Board of Commissioners, you know, they have their pressures, unbalanced the land bank's economics to take the money to balance their own budget. Back to the point about continuous improvement. Working in Ohio, and I'm sure there's been a lot more development since then, but I just go back to where I left. working in Ohio, we developed a method to formalize that role so that a county treasurer can attach a cost that goes to land bank operation and maintenance. Now, I don't know how that's played itself out, because that's about the time that I moved on to the most dysfunctional institution in the history of the United States. But your point is, we've got to make sure that it's not just going to the federal government. Like, even when we were working on NSP, it always confounded me that communities would do backflips in the NSP competition, because there was I think it was NSP 2 that was the competitive round. And when we would go and talk to them about their ideas, well, very often what we would see is that they had millions of dollars slipping through their fingers every day by selling tax liens to people, who will take that value somewhere else where it could have been redirected to their home community to do exactly what you're talking about. So it's not just a matter of getting more corpus out of the federal government, but actually rethinking systems back home. I think where the federal role comes in, we ought to incentivize that. We ought to condition some of our support on states who get it right and actually take these models to scale. I think I need to finish. Thank you all. It's good to be back. Thank you so much.